I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Good morning. I'm Howard Husick, Vice President of the Manhattan Institute. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. We're living in an era in which questions about the appropriate structure and direction of our financial and economic systems are both the subjects of deep discussion and dispute. At such a time, we might assume and hope that our institutions of higher education are preparing students to appreciate the essentials of that system and to participate in any debate ongoing. Yet, according to a Council for Economic Education Standards survey, students appear less than well informed about some economic essentials. For instance, fewer than half of students understand that were banks to raise interest rates from 5 to 8%, wouldn't that be nice, by the way, savings would likely increase. In a similar survey, when asked who might be adversely affected by high inflation, fewer than 6% of students correctly chose the answer, older people living on fixed retirement income. And according to a survey conducted by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, only about half of all graduates correctly define free enterprise as a system in which individual citizens create, exchange, and control goods and services. In fact, 13% believe it's a system in which demand and supply are decided through majority vote. Such misconceptions matter, and not just as handicaps in making personal financial decisions, although they assuredly are that. For without grounding, our next generation of citizens will lack the context in which to assess whether criticisms of our free enterprise system are at all well-founded, whether they are important new insights or just recycled canards. Without a knowledge of the history of how markets and regulation evolved, they will lack the basis on which both to judge where we are and to influence where we're heading. These sorts of moral sentiments, to coin a phrase, have inspired our gathering here today. In this conference entitled Capitalism on Campus, What Are Students Learning and What Should They Know?, we will take stock of the present state of instruction in matters of free enterprise and political economy, that transdisciplinary topic in which economics, law, culture, politics, and history can all be represented. Are students being exposed to such matters? If they are not, why not? What's more, what should or can we do to remedy the situation? We'll explore these topics with a distinguished panel drawn from the ranks of leading economists, historians, and political scientists, whom I'll introduce shortly. We'll divide our time into two overarching tasks: understanding the problem and crafting the substance and methods that might ameliorate it. Finally, Robert George, founder and director of Princeton University's Madison Center on Constitutional Studies and Political Thought, will discuss more broadly over lunch the ways in which university cultures can be changed. We'll begin with remarks from two people who have done a great deal to make this conference possible today. James Pearson is both Institute Senior Fellow and Director of our Center for the American University, under whose auspices the program today is being held. Marilyn Fedak is the Vice Chair of Investment Services at Alliance Bernstein, the leading equity research firm and a close friend and loyal supporter of the Manhattan Institute. She'll discuss what inspired her to become deeply involved in the topics of this conference and to establish the Marilyn G. Fedak Capitalism Project. Now, Jim Pearson.
Thanks very much, Howard. And on behalf of the Manhattan Institute and the Center for the American University, welcome. Thanks to all of our guests for coming today. This promises to be an illuminating conference. And thanks especially to our panelists and to Marilyn Fedak, who conceived of this project many months ago and whose support has made it possible. The Center for the American University was established 4 years ago as a vehicle both to study higher education in America and also to offer constructive external criticism of this large and influential industry. We know that criticism in the absence of constructive alternatives is often ineffective and generally ignored. And so when we identify problems, we like to point to ways of addressing them. To that end, the CAU sponsors lectures, book luncheons, and conferences like this one on subjects ranging from free speech on campus to the financial aspects of higher education. Our website, mindingthecampus.com, collects and displays the latest articles on higher education. Our fellows, John Leo, Anthony Paletta, Charlotte Allen, and yours truly, write their own original pieces on higher education. We are ably assisted in these efforts by Allison Smith and appreciate the encouragement given to the project by Larry Moan and the trustees of the Manhattan Institute. The Veritas Fund, of which I am chairman, is a centerpiece of our efforts on behalf of campus reform. The fund was launched with donations several years ago from Peter Flanagan and Tom Smith, and has since received support from many other donors. These pooled contributions have allowed us to allocate more than $4 million over the last 3 years to some 27 different college and university programs that address the interrelated subjects of liberty, limited government, and democratic citizenship. These include institutions large and small, from populous state universities like the University of Texas to small liberal arts colleges like Rhodes College. A complete list of these programs is available on our website and in the packet distributed to participants. These programs are directed by faculty on the respective campuses and are supported by modest grants from the Veritas Fund and local contributions. The goal of these programs is to reach undergraduate students with courses and lectures that would not otherwise be offered. These grants follow from our basic rule, which is that in order to promote reform, we must point to positive models for others to emulate. The Veritas Fund does not have the riches of a Bill Gates or Warren Buffett. We have some money in the bank, and we've been able to stretch our funds by forming a matching partnership with the Jack Miller Center, which is represented today by Mike Andrews. We're grateful for that. The funds are carefully husbanded, and they have an outsized impact because the mere presence of these programs on campus is worthy of notice. We are grateful to our donors. Naturally, we welcome any inquiries about these efforts. This conference addresses the large subject of capitalism, or as our founding fathers called it, the system of natural liberty. This is a pressing subject today in the midst of a long recession and a deep financial crisis. Many harbor doubts about the future of a system that has given us unprecedented freedom and prosperity. They would like the material benefits of capitalism, but without some of its inconvenient side effects. Irving Kristol once offered 2 cheers for capitalism, but even that lukewarm endorsement would be too enthusiastic for many people today, including many on college faculties who have the responsibility for instructing the young about the institutions that will shape their future. Our purpose, however, is to promote an understanding of this complex system and its various economic, political, and moral dimensions. This is not an easy task, but it is an urgent one today. Once we have done so, the cheers, whatever their number, will take care of themselves. And so, in that spirit, we've assembled this panel of distinguished thinkers to discuss the dual questions: what are students learning today about capitalism, and ideally, what should they know? We look forward to their commentary. Thank you very much. Welcome to our conference. And now let me turn the podium over to Marilyn Fedak, and thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Howard. And most of all, thank you all for joining us today. I am so excited. I feel like I've been working on this project for a very long gestation period of about 18 months, and now it's finally coming to fruition. So thank you all for joining us. I hope, I expect we will have a great program. Let me tell you a little bit about the Capitalism Project, and then specifically what we are hoping to accomplish today. Now, the genesis of this idea came to me about 18 months ago. I am sure you all remember that time. It was just about at the nadir of the financial crisis. And I got to tell you, I still have to take a deep breath whenever I talk about it. It was a very, very scary time. I've been in the investment business for 38 years. And I got to tell you, by 2007, I kind of thought I had seen it all. I never saw anything like the financial crisis. And let me tell you, I hope that we never have to see it again. I know everyone in the room understands how serious the environment was. But I don't think that unless you were in the markets every day trading or trying to trade, unless you were talking to company managements, unless you owned, as I did, financial stocks, I don't think you know how close we really came to a total collapse of our financial system. And of course, in an environment like that, everybody in the public domain felt free to inveigh on the evils of capitalism, right? You know, the greedy vultures of Wall Street had to be stopped. We needed massive government intervention, both to stem the tide and to make sure that such a crisis never happened again. And I think that even worse than the rhetoric were the actions that were being taken. As we all know, companies, major industries within this country were being nationalized or quasi-nationalized. Bankruptcy law was being subverted. If you were an owner of the senior debt of Chrysler, your property rights, forget about it. They were abrogated. And so it was during this period that I really began to think, oh my God, capitalism in America is under attack. What can I do? What can we do to support it? Now, I have to admit that my initial response to the attacks on capitalism were very self-referential. To paraphrase that great baseball player, Roberto Clemente, capitalism has been very good to me. So in a lot of different ways, I'm going to give you a few stories here. So let me give you a couple of quick stories. Let me start with my grandfather, my father's father. He came to the United States from Russia at the age of 9. He came alone with only his 12-year-old brother. Can you imagine? My friends wouldn't let their 9-year-olds walk 3 blocks to school by themselves. How did 9 and 12-year-olds get from Russia to the United States? You know, I wish I had asked him more details when he was alive. Of course, I didn't. I wasn't that interested back then. But eventually, they made it to the United States. They sold pencils and newspapers on corners in the Lower East Side. Eventually, my grandfather got enough money together that he started a luggage and leather goods store on Nassau Street downtown. That enabled him and my grandmother to raise 5 boys in Brooklyn. You know, this is the typical classical immigration story. And then some of those sons, including my father, took over the store, turned it into a wholesale business, and that enabled them to raise their families in the suburbs of New York. I'm sure if I went around this room, there would be very similar stories from many people in the room. Okay, fast forward a generation to me. At the age of 11, I asked my father to bring home a typewriter from his office for me, and I taught myself to touch type. I don't really remember why I did this, but I've always been a very practical girl and very ambitious. So when I was 14, I got my first job as a clerk typist in an office. Over the next 5 years, I earned enough money to pay for my first 2 years of college. Now, that isn't as impressive as it sounds. College was a lot cheaper back then. I still have a bill from Smith, I think it was 1966, room, board, and tuition for a year, $2,850. But even more important than the money that I earned was the self-respect, of self-sufficiency that the experience gave me. And that has served me well my entire life. Finally, I got to experience capitalism's benefits on a kind of a broader, more societal level, as a job creation machine and a way for personal growth. In 1984, I joined a small asset management company, Sanford C. Bernstein & Company. At the time, we managed $2 billion of client assets. We had 200 employees. Today, we manage $460 billion of client assets, and we have 4,500 employees. Now, I am extremely proud of the financial success of the peace of mind that we gave our clients over this period, but I've got to tell you, I am equally proud of the thousands of jobs that we created, as well as the careers that we launched and the companies that were started by people that left the firm that are alumni of our firm. Now, when I began to think about this project and how to attack it, I set off on my mission, and kind of in the guise of the good research analyst that I once was, to talk to a lot of people who I thought could give me some guidance on how to attack this problem. And many of you are in the room, so again, thank you very much. And a very interesting thing happened along the way. I began to understand how important capitalism was on a very deeper level, not just to create jobs and to provide, avenues for personal growth, but to provide the very underpinnings for our legal system, our institutions, our values, our personal liberties, our freedoms. And that made it even more important to me, and I began to think that the project in a very different way. It also dovetailed very neatly with something that I have noticed over the many years that I've been in business about recent college graduates and young people. And that is that I noticed a pervasive, I keep trying to think of a different word, but I think disdain is really the word that comes to mind among many of our best and our brightest with regard to business. They didn't see it, they don't see it as a noble endeavor, as something with moral underpinnings. They saw it, as kind of a stepping stone along the way, maybe a path to a more noble, to a higher level purpose, to work for a nonprofit, or perhaps as a community activist. And so you can see when I began to think of the problem in that way, why it was such a natural for me to define this mission in terms of educating the next generation of our leaders to the benefits of capitalism. And I think that you can also see why it was such a natural for me to match up, to partner with the Center for the American University and its Veritas Fund. Now, let me be clear. We are not interested in, we have no intention of hard selling capitalism here. We want students to examine it with its warts as well as its beauty marks. I think that's the only way they will really buy into understanding it. We know, as Jim noted, like Irving Kristol, that capitalism is not perfect. But to, badly paraphrase Winston Churchill on democracy, it's a heck of a lot better than anything else that is out there. Let me close by telling you what we hope will happen today. We have a great group of distinguished panelists joining us. They come from a variety of different intellectual traditions and backgrounds, but they all share a very strong belief in the importance of understanding the historical understanding and backdrop of capitalism. So we expect a lively and productive exchange of ideas. This conference is not the end of this project. This conference is the beginning. What we hope is that we will be able to turn some of these ideas that we get today into initiatives that we, and I hope others in the room, will help us support. So with that, let me turn the podium back over to Howard Usick and our panelists to get the discussion going. Thank you again so much for coming today.
Thanks so much, Jim and Marilyn. We now turn to our discussion, for which I'll ask our panel members to come up en masse. As Marilyn said, our panel representing a wide range of institutions and disciplines, geographically, and a lot of other ways. I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Their full biographies are in your program. First on my left and going down the row, Bill Butos is professor of economics at Trinity College, Hartford, as well as visiting research fellow at New York University's Austrian economics program. Ryan Hanley is associate professor of political science at Marquette University, and he's the author of Adam Smith and the Character of Virtue. Daniel Klein, professor of economics at George Mason University, and the editor of Econ Journal Watch, where he tracks the ideological character of the profession. More about that later from Dan. Jeffrey Miron is senior lecturer in the Department of Economics, Harvard University, where he is also the department's director of undergraduate studies. Jerry Mueller is professor of history at the Catholic University in Washington and the author of The Mind and the Market, Capitalism in European Thought. His lecture series, Thinking About Capitalism, was released in 2009 by the Teaching Company. And Sandra Pert is Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies at the University of Richmond. She also serves on the editorial board of the Journal of the History of Economic Thought and is past president of the History of Economic Society. I'd also like to introduce very briefly Charlotte Allen, who you've heard about before on our Minding the Campus site. She's a distinguished policy journalist, and she's going to be preparing a paper based on what you're hearing today. And I'm now going to try to get a little more informal and sit down in this chair. And we're going to run this discussion style. And let me try to start off this way. We heard in our introductions a sense that students have certain attitudes about the economic system. You guys are on the front lines, so I thought maybe we'd start off with a report from the front lines. What do students know, and what's their opinion about what they think they know? And Sandra, if I could start with you. You have a summer program that focuses both on faculty and students to spread the idea of teaching economic history more broadly. What do you observe among students at University of Richmond particularly?
Let me just say thank you for inviting me here. And I did ask my students this very question, although we didn't plan this, last week. So I teach a course to undergraduates. It's cross-listed in economics and leadership studies at the University of Richmond. And all of these students are doing economics as well as a major in my school, at the Jepson School. And they all told me that what they're doing at this point, and most of these are seniors, they're juniors and seniors, but mostly seniors, that they are doing very technical work. And I wasn't surprised. So they're in a senior seminar at this point, and they're trying to see whether if they change an exogenous variable by a certain amount, what happens to the model's predictions. And I said, do you discuss whether the variable should be endogenous or exogenous? And they all said, no, that's not a discussion that we have. And so one of the things I think we should be thinking about here is whether students are getting, in economics, are talking about the big questions of economics, the assumptions that we make, and so on, some of which have been shown to have been perhaps ill-formed in the last couple of years. And I think that at the undergraduate level, it's true that they're not getting those big questions.
And so you're talking about students who have made the choice to go into an economics major, which I believe is either the number 1 or 2 most popular major. So this is not a small group of students, not unimportant. But let's even take a bigger step back, and maybe I'll turn to Bill Butos. At a school like Trinity, which is a important, selective, elite, if I might, liberal arts school, what about the general populace?
Well, I would just say that it presents a lot of challenges. Students come in very energetic very often. They are motivated, but they come in with notable deficiencies in their background. I teach principles from time to time. That's a freshman course usually. And I find that the students who have had, quote, economics at the high school level require the most deprogramming. So
deprogramming, okay.
That's right. But it goes beyond that, and it's
well, how were they programmed? You can't let that go by without pouncing on it.
Okay. What they come in with is a kind of I guess kind of a New York Times view of the world in which Keynesian economics rules and the market is subject to massive and persistent failure. It's those sorts of challenges that I speak of in the principles course in particular. The problem, of course, they have no analytical framework from which to draw those kinds of conclusions. They simply are mimicking what they've read elsewhere. And if I could just extend on another
Please.
point, please. But it goes beyond that, actually, because I've noticed students increasingly, and I've been at Trinity now 30 years, come in less well prepared, not just in something like economics, which can be fairly technical, but also in history, philosophy, and what Adam Smith would have referred to as the moral sciences. And it's that lack of preparation intellectually on the foundations of the social sciences and philosophy that I find probably the most difficult obstacle to getting through to them.
And so when something like the financial crisis occurs, are you implying they're less well prepared to appreciate its nuances, shall we say?
Well, yes, and that doesn't apply just to the freshmen. It applies to the majors in the economics department as well. And of course, they go through a lot of different courses where they are typically, and I don't limit this to Trinity at all, typically taught that it's massive market failure, as Miron suggested, at the root cause of this. So these are some significant challenges. The only way I know of dealing with that is to develop some good ideas and try to extend those ideas to the students.
We'll get to that, I promise.
I'm sure.
I got to get out of the economics profession here then for a minute, with apologies to my two economists in the middle there, and step back even further. I mean, what's the buzz on campus is really what I'm searching for. Does that make any sense to you, Ryan?
Sure, although my campus might have its own idiosyncrasies. Teaching at a Midwestern Catholic university, the sorts of students that I get actually are remarkably fun to teach, ethically serious, quite earnest, many of them attracted to the university for issues of social justice. So they're already prepared to take the questions at the heart of capitalism very seriously, even if they enter with some skepticism. But I've seen it as my task, since I don't teach in a department of economics, and I am teaching these sorts of students, to try and meet them where they stand, as it were, and to ask capitalism, how does it respond to these central questions that are already on their minds? Questions of justice and fairness, questions of what is the best life. So when we teach the political philosophy of capitalism, we start perhaps with some skepticism, but some appreciation already that these are the sorts of questions that need to be asked, and indeed we need to have that global picture that Sandra refers to.
Well, how deep is this skepticism? I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, what's the contours of the problem, if it is a problem that we're addressing here? Jerry, do you want to weigh on that from the perspective of a historian and a historian of capitalism?
Sure. Capitalism is a multifaceted subject. It's to think of it just in a few caricatured terms. I mean, it has key central components in terms of private property, legally free labor, prices set primarily by competition. All of those are based in good part on the existence of government, without which there is no private property or legally free labor and so on. So so the notion that markets are good and that government is bad, or that you can have one without the other, is, I think, a fallacy. And capitalism is multifaceted in the sense that it's historical, that is, it's changing all the time. It has many varieties in the present, and it has ramifications for almost every area of life. Friedrich Hayek once pointed out that there's no such thing as economic values. That is to say that people pursue money as a means to many other purposes that they have in terms of social status and sexual attraction and providing for their families and developing themselves as individuals. So it has all sorts of ramifications for capitalism, for the history of the family, for the way in which people define themselves over time and so on. And because of that, it's both fascinating and hard to convey, hard to get a sense of what it's like as a whole. So on the one hand, I don't see any massive wave of antipathy to capitalism on most college campuses. I did some extremely methodologically sophisticated research on this, and I have a little handout there that I prepared for you where I happened to be looking up a colleague at Dartmouth. And on the history department website, they had a list of what history department majors who graduated last year decided to do thereafter. And if you look at it, you'll see these are not Leninist cadres that are being produced at Dartmouth, which is one of our elite universities, and history, which is a discipline that is subject to ideological propensities, though it's not heavily ideologized in the way that some humanistic disciplines could be. But if you look at what they're doing, I removed their last names, it turns out that of the 14 that are listed here, and then I did some very sophisticated quantitative analysis too, I found out that of the 15, 5 of them are going into finance, mostly with firms not too far away from here. 3 of them are going into law, 2 are going into medical research, 2 are going into education, 1's going into another business, and 1's going into what you might call good works. I think that this is not, it's my impression that this is not unrepresentative at all. So I don't think that there's massive anti-capitalism on campus. What there is, partly because of ideological propensities, but partly because of the academic division of labor, is a difficulty in conveying capitalism in all its interest and all its multifacetedness. And the division of labor within both the existence of departments of economics and within departments of economics probably is an exacerbating factor in terms of not giving people a sense of the big picture, the large ethical issues, the large historical developments, the relationship of capitalism to all these other things, the state, the family, and so on. So on the one hand, it may be true, as some people have pointed out, that there's a certain left-of-center ideological propensity in the professoriate, in the social sciences, in the humanities. If so, I don't think it matters very much because students, especially smart students, don't form their opinions on the basis of what they hear from their professors in my experience. They're much more affected by larger trends in the world. And a lot of those trends lead them to have to come to terms in one way or another with their future in a market economy. Plus, they're always buying stuff in the market economy. So there are problems, but I don't think they're ones of students being brainwashed into fundamental antipathy to the institutions of a capitalist welfare state society.
Well, let's play with that.
Yeah.
And the fact that students are choosing to go into professions, finance. By the way, I noticed on your list, not many are going into business. That is, starting their own businesses, which I think David Brooks recently pointed out in a column about the British disease, that we may have a retreat from actual enterprise. And so maybe the list is not quite as cheery as you're implying. But might that not beg the question of whether, in the face of criticism of the overall system, they will, as citizens, be prepared to weigh in, to argue, to battle in the court of public opinion to protect the system that they're enjoying? And I can't help but turn to Dan Klein, because you raised the question of whether there, I think you used brainwashing, but antipathy amongst faculty. And Dan's serious research work has been done on the political attitudes of faculty members. Is it just an urban legend that the faculty is leaning left in our academy, or talk about it, would you?
Yeah, it's certainly not a legend. It's been confirmed time and again, principally by surveys. Voter registration studies also help and confirm the general result. You've got hundreds of thousands of professors we're trying to generalize about, and what is it you actually look at, try to measure and report? Political party affiliation and voting is one, and in the humanities and social sciences.
Give us the numbers, because I know you've got them.
In the humanities and social sciences, which are the most important fields for this matter, because whether a math teacher leans a certain way probably isn't going to affect his geometry so much. It's probably about 7 or 8 to 1 voting Democrat to voting Republican. That's excluding 2-year colleges, by the way, so 4-year colleges and universities. 7 or 8 to 1 among the humanities and social science professors. A lot of the Republicans in that would be in economics, where the ratio is probably like 2.5 Democrats to 1 Republican. So if you take econ out of it, there's really, it's quite scarce. And Democrat to Republican is just one way to look at it. I think actually more informative is surveys that ask about their policy views on a range of issues. And these again show that they're not very friendly to natural liberty, I'd have to say.
Okay, tell us about the examples are useful.
Well, I did a survey of 6 scholarly associations: the American Anthropological Association, the American Historical Association, 6 of these major national associations, asking 18 policy issues, and the positions they would take on the minimum wage, schooling, drug policy, and so on, were just very consistently interventionist or siding with status quo interventions. The Republicans were more pro-liberty than the Democrats, but it was disappointing how little much more they were. And so you get a pretty good sense of their policy views, their policy sensibilities, and there's very few people who are serious about natural liberty, as you put it earlier, I'd have to say. We've also found that the folks who vote Democratic actually have a narrower tent in terms of their policy views. They often have more of a party line than the folks who vote Republican. The Republicans, in that sense, are more diverse in their policy views, okay, which might reflect the kind of libertarian conservative fusionism under a kind of perhaps Republican voting tent, and they actually have more diversity in their views. There's other interesting things about the data I could bring out. We found that the folks who vote Republican are more likely to be outside of academia. Again, we surveyed members of these scholarly associations.
So there are people with PhDs.
Right. These are scholars. You know, the line that, well, Republicans aren't intellectual and aren't interested in ideas, and that's why they're not on the faculty. Well, why are they members of the American Historical Association? And they had much higher rates of being outside, of having landed outside of academia, whether it's in private sector or independent research or government. Other things we found were that this ratio has changed over time. 30 or 40 years ago, it was probably more like 4 to 1, whereas, as I said, it's probably more like 7 or 8 to 1 now. So the trend has been in a very definite direction. I think in a lot of these disciplines, it's really quite uniform, and I don't expect that to change soon, I'm afraid.
Okay, so let's kind of review the bidding and where we are so far. We've got Bill Butos, who's saying, well, there's a kind of a reflexive New York Times editorial page, economic conventional wisdom he observes on campus. Ryan Hanley says his political science students come in with a engagement, but a kind of a default towards social justice, meaning, well, there's some problem that has to be addressed. There's an assumption in the interest in social justice. Now, what are the causes that are underlying? And Sandra has given us one explanation. The economics profession is so narrow, all it thinks about is endogenous versus exogenous. There will be a test at the end of the, right. Jerry says, no, it's about the disciplines don't like to talk to each other. It's not really a conspiracy of shared values. And Dan is, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the very fact that you asked the question about the political proclivities of the faculty implies that you think it matters somewhat. Yeah. So now let me turn to you, Jeff, and say among those 3 possibilities, right? Economics profession self-criticism, right? Larger criticism of the disciplines, and the attitudes. Let's start with the attitudes. Do you think faculty attitudes at Harvard do lean left the way that Dan is talking about and are pushing the students toward that side of the political spectrum and a skepticism about the economic system.
So, sort of to go back to a couple of the points that led up to that, students certainly come in knowing very little economics, and if they've learned some, it's mainly in these required social sciencey economics course, other than the AP economics curriculum. And the non-AP courses are abysmal. They are absolutely sort of very left, very New York Times-y. But what does that mean in terms of what students come in with overall in terms of their attitudes, their perspectives, their politics? My impression is they come in looking like their parents. So there are plenty of Harvard students, and I assume this is true of every place else because it's sort of the same pool applying to all these places. There are plenty of libertarians, there are plenty of Republicans, there are plenty of liberals, there are plenty of, a few flaming sort of Marxists. And it just makes sense. Most kids everywhere kind of end up initially with politics like their parents' politics. So that's a broad cross-section. It's pretty diverse. Are the faculty, especially in the social sciences, and I think actually applies outside the social sciences, I think applies in the sciences as well, even though you don't see it in the classroom teaching about geometry. Do they lean left? Absolutely. I only have anecdotal evidence. Dan has real evidence, but my anecdotal evidence is entirely consistent with his. So if they're to learn, we're not only talking about what they know coming in, but are they to learn and what do they learn? In terms of a rigidity, a resistance to hiring people who have different views, I don't have detailed information outside of economics. In economics, and this is, Dan sort of hinted at this, there is absolutely no rigidity, no resistance to hiring people who are Republicans or libertarians. It turns out the fraction who lean that way is well less than a half, but many of the people who identify themselves as liberals or Democrats amongst economists are actually sort of soft libertarians, okay, not sort of hardcore liberals. And on economic issues, they're very much moderate to free market oriented. So I don't see examples of the horror stories you read about in newspapers of someone who happened to have conservative views.
In economics classrooms.
I'm talking economics faculty for the second. In terms of whether the teaching changes the attitudes of the students, whether the left lean, I don't see it that much. My impression is that they leave college with similar political views to the ones they left with, whether they learned a lot of economics and understood it or not, okay? And so the negative influence, if you think it's a negative, of the left-leaning faculty is probably not zero, but I don't think it's overwhelming. I think that the kids, as Jerry suggested, they think, they question, they ask, they have a lot of influences on them besides just what happens in the classroom, and so they're not, on average, tilted substantially to be more left-leaning by virtue of the instruction, even admitting that the instruction definitely has a left-leaning tilt in many
Definitely
cases.
has. Well, let's play with that a little bit. Ryan, you seem like you want to weigh in on that.
Yeah, no, it's definitely with a left-leaning tilt. I mean, in many ways, Howard, when you sort of summarized my comments, you focused, I think, rightly on the phrase social justice, which is at a Jesuit campus, something that many of the students come in with a penchant for, who after all could possibly be against social justice. But it depends on how that, of course, is defined. And in some circles, that would be sort of a buzzword for a quick interpretation of redistributive economics. For others, and people interested in the magisterium of the church have a much different, more complex understanding. But for us, the challenge becomes to take these terms that the students already come to the table with, social justice in particular, and rather than simply ask left versus right, to try and have some clarity about what we might mean and indeed how capitalism might affect that. So we begin with questions on the minds of all of my students, left or right, about central questions of poverty. My university happens to be in an area that is doing its best to gentrify, but in the post-industrial urban Midwest, that's not an easy thing to do.
City of Milwaukee, by the way.
Milwaukee, yes. And so poverty is something that's deeply familiar to all of them, and social justice resonates. As they begin to look at some of the central documents in the history of capitalism, they understand that some of the more dogmatic approaches or simplified or dime store versions of capitalism that would simply turn the back on the poor and keep on moving and the rich get richer. These sorts of things that they may, those who are interested in social justice, come to the table with, quickly realize that these break down, especially on central questions of poverty that speak to both the left and the right. So one only has to read a little bit into Adam Smith to see that, in fact, poverty is one of his chief concerns. He doesn't express it in the same way we talk about inequality today. But alleviating poverty through capitalism is news to many of them, and it's one of the ways that they can get excited without feeling like their politics are being challenged, without feeling that this is a left-right divide, by taking a central issue and showing that capitalism speaks directly to that and that Adam Smith speaks directly to that. This is one of the ways I think that we can helpfully and productively engage students where they stand across the variety of the political spectrum and bring the central issues of capitalism to bear on what they care about.
Let's talk about how common it is for students to have the benefit of these kinds of interactions and what they might be. Are there courses in which they hear, English courses? A lot of them are not taking your political science courses. What's the default among those humanities professors that Dan was talking about? Is that something that we need to be concerned about, or is that really not all that important? Bill, Sandra, you want to get in? Okay.
Since Adam Smith was invoked, I feel like I need to speak. Let me say that many students on campuses today can't distinguish between Adam Smith and Mandeville. Mandeville writes The Fable of the Bees, in which everyone is part of this grumbling hive and we're all selfish and purely selfish and only selfish. We have no other regarding interests. And that's the caricature of Adam Smith that is presented to many of our students today, both within economics as a discipline and in English courses and history courses and so on. I'm stating this strongly, and I'm sure someone might want to push back, but to say that Adam Smith is about selfishness and only selfishness is to give a false impression of Adam Smith. He starts TMS, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, writing that though we might expect nothing in return, we are, all of us, interested in the happiness of others. So not for reputational purposes, not because we want to trade with them, but simply because the happiness of you matters somewhat. Not entirely, to me, that's one of the sort of moral groundings of Smithian economics. That has been written out of, in some respect, the economics that students learn on campuses. And it's a tremendously important insight. It's an insight that says we're all a messy sort of combination of both self-interest and other regarding interests, and that those play out in a capitalist society where there is property and so on, in ways that help us all, as Ryan said, help us all innovate and put ideas into place and create wealth. And that story about capitalism has largely, I think, been taken over by another story which says that Robert Malthus cheerfully predicted that many of us would starve. And that caricature, too, is wrong about Malthus. And so one of my, the points that I'm very passionate about is if you give the students texts and you let them actually read what Malthus wrote and what Smith wrote, they'll be both surprised and they'll come out of those readings with a much more nuanced, and this goes to Jerry's point, appreciation of just what this capitalist world is like and the people who interact within it are like.
And so the question is, if they are exposed, and so we're playing with the question of, are they, and if not, why not? Now, Jerry, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can weigh in on this. I think there's an additional aspect of the problem. It has much less to do with ideological propensities of the faculty than a certain self-selection process by which those people who go into any of the humanities and most of the social sciences outside of economics have a propensity to be simply disinterested in economic life. And not only that, but they live in a world in which talk matters, or what they call discourse. And so they think that everything in the world is talk. Now, a lot of things that happen in the world are about talk, including terrible things like talk radio. But
we'll talk about that later.
Right. But my point is, there's a self-selection process by which they tend to be disinterested in material factors and economic processes in history. So that even though there's some excellent, say, economic history being written, and history that deals with capitalism in a broad sense, in the senses in which I've tried to describe it, most historians are not interested in that. That's the truth. And certainly I think that would hold true for many people in other branches of the social sciences, and even more so, as I say, in humanities and philosophy. It's not that they hold it's not that they hold well-versed critiques of capitalism. It's that they're not very interested in this whole productive Marxist, productive market process. The Marxist was a Freudian slip, because one of the good things about Marxism is that it did call people's attention to economic factors. And this trinity that was active in the academy 10 or 15 years ago of race, class, and gender. What's fallen out...
That was 10, 15 years ago?
Yeah. What's fallen out is class, because that really does have to do with economic processes. So I think that I think in many ways, in terms of exposing students to the issues of living in a capitalist society and so on, it's more a problem of disinterest than a problem of antipathy. I don't know how my colleagues here feel about that.
This is getting really interestingly subtle, right? So we have, it could be that they lean away some way politically, and Jerry banks that and says, well, I'll see that and I'll raise you, right? It's important, but it's not really the decisive factor. And Sandra says, yeah, probably, but her discipline is also uninterested in these larger historical and cultural factors. Bill, you were chomping at the bit here.
Not really, but I'm aware of an informal study that was done, and it measured students who had taken principles of economics courses and then were retested sequentially afterward. And what the survey finds is that the half-life of economic knowledge is incredibly short, even for economics majors. So one of the suggestions I've heard, which makes a lot of sense to me, is that the students ought to repeat the Principles of Economics course as their senior seminar. But this speaks, I think, partly to Sandra's point and to Jeff's point as well, that there's something going on in the way that we instruct students in economics and provide them with the tools for understanding what markets do and how they work and how well they work, that is falling short. And the evidence that I've seen, and I personally can corroborate some of this, is that students leave college perhaps having taken a lot of economics courses and seem not to have learned very much economics ultimately, other than maybe running some regressions from time to time. So I think there's some real issues here regarding the nature of instruction and the narrative that they're receiving about markets while they're taking economics courses.
So that's a really interesting point. The narrative is a different matter than, in effect, the math that Sandra is focusing on. So you're echoing what Sandra is saying, that there is no uber narrative that draws students in and reinforces that knowledge. But let's talk briefly about what students are exposed to by saying, well, maybe they ought to take this course again, right? Are students inevitably exposed, whether they learn or not, whether the instruction is as high quality as the members on this panel deliver or not, right? How many students can simply go through and not be exposed, right? Dan, you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. The idea that students will take to these ideas, if you know, a Bill Butos or a Ryan Hanley is excited and offering these seminars and, you know, making it available, engaging them in discourse, I think it's true. I think there's a big latent demand in the student population. At Santa Clara University, I started and ran a civil society institute, which was of that nature, and I had a lot of customers. I think, however, that it's often lacking, and again, particularly outside of economics. Even within economics, I don't think it's terribly prevalent. But especially outside of economics, I don't think they're getting that much access or exposure. So even if students are not influenced that much by their professors, the fact that they don't get exposed to some of these core ideas and important thinkers is still a tragedy. I mean, they may not be influenced, but what was not accomplished, what they missed, what was foregone, is still the tragedy.
Right. So there's the how they were taught, which Bill is saying, and then whether they even get exposed in the first place. How much of this has to do with, Jim Pearson just had a great article in the Wall Street Journal I refer everybody to, on Columbia versus Harvard. I'm afraid Harvard got the short end of the stick here, Jeff, but it wasn't about you, I know that. But his point was that the evolution in the last 30 years, and there was recently a survey by the Alumni and Trustees Council on the emergence of distributional requirements as opposed to core requirements. This is clearly the ascendant mode in undergraduate education. How much does the fact that one, as an undergraduate, takes one from column A, one from column B, one from column C, rather than, well, no, the history of economic thought is a required course, right? How much does that have to do with the lack of exposure that Dan is talking about? And Jeff, you're in the seat there.
It has very, very, very little to do with it, because except in a few extreme cases, the core curriculum programs still had room for some choice. They still had a lot of opportunity for students to select against, away from something that they might not think they were interested in, a pro-capitalism or a pro-freedom sort of course. And even when those courses might have been taught, in a core curriculum, they were frequently taught by someone who was very critical of the capitalism or the freedom ideas. Second, I would emphasize that the classroom is only one place. Students spend a lot of their time outside the classroom, arguing with their fellow classmates. And if any of the classmates read the Wall Street Journal or read Hayek or read Friedman or speak back in class against sort of left-leaning ideas, a lot of the students hear that, they respond to it, they argue about it. So I think it's a very small factor. I mean,
right. Well, okay, well, let's save that thought about outside of class. But Dan, you want to weigh in on the other side there at all?
I just wanted to comment that the study done of the core curricular requirements by Ann Neal's group, I forget the name of it now.
ACTA, I think.
ACTA, yeah, showed that economics was almost never part of the core requirements. I mean, I think that the idea that most students get an economics course is wrong. I think most of them don't. And the ones that do, probably just one introductory course. And that could be like Sandy was saying, rather technical in nature, could be leaning a certain way. Again, I don't think there's that much exposure.
Right. Sandra, you're seconding that?
Yes, but I would also add that within economics, which is a very large major on our campuses across the country, the history of economic thought requirement has largely been dropped. That's true at both the graduate and the undergraduate levels. And with some exceptions, and George Mason might be one, the University of Toronto another, there are just not places where a graduate student can go study and write a dissertation which has any connection to the history of ideas. Possibly a chapter at Duke, but not a dissertation in the history of ideas. So we're not now educating those people who can go to an undergraduate institution and teach with any competence the history of economic ideas within economics.
And just a couple more before we're going to go to a short break. But Ryan, and I want to get back to Jerry. But go ahead.
You had mentioned the history of economic thought, which is a very challenging thing to find a job in. I have many friends getting PhDs, and there just simply aren't many positions.
But that's revealing.
It is revealing, but at the same time, one wonders in the strategy to move forward whether recovering that would be one aspect of the problem, but also another aspect of the solution has to be to remember that these things shouldn't be bifurcated. I was thinking when you were mentioning great books programs, I had the good fortune of teaching at Yale's wonderful directed studies program. It's one of the really great books programs. And when I taught the history of modern philosophy, modern political philosophy, the texts that we looked at are Locke, Smith, Tocqueville, Mill, Marx. And one of the things the students come away from is realizing that capitalism, commercial society, economics is not some small segment that should be pursued within the context of a specialized discipline, but is in fact fundamental to the philosophical traditions of the West and is in fact integrated in a larger vision of society. And that sort of thing, I think, can be very healthy, rather than just seeing that history of economic thought as something that one person out there on campus does, but in fact that this is an integral part of a much broader conversation that many people would recognize as fundamental, insofar as the canon is fundamental or those thinkers are fundamental. I think that's healthy to encourage within students and thinking practically how to move forward, remembering that that's a big part of the tradition of modern political philosophy rather than something off to the side.
And I think really that the goal here is to think about how to expose that integrated idea of Western political and economic thought to students. And we've heard about some of the obstacles. Just one last thing before break. Jerry, you talked about the obstacle, what I would call specialization, as an obstacle. And I think Ryan's saying the same thing. How do you feel?
Yes, actually, I mean, even a course on the history of economic thought as that sub-discipline, now a very marginal one, is constituted, would actually not draw you into a lot of the big issues in the history of capitalism and history of thinking about capitalism. So there's a very real sense in which the specialization of knowledge, which has a lot of advantages, some of them described by Adam Smith at the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, also has certain costs, which is actually a subject that he deals with towards the end of The Wealth of Nations. But one of them is a kind of potential, and in this case real, fragmentation of knowledge, such that on college campuses, it's not because of the evils of the university, it's because of the structure of modern knowledge, it's hard to get a handle on any big question. On the development of the modern state, the changing nature of military structures over time, the history and various perspectives on capitalism. Those are big issues that actually everybody ideally should think about and be exposed to, but because they are by definition transdisciplinary, people are unlikely to be exposed to them in the context of disciplinary-based courses, which is why those few exceptions to disciplinary-based programs, like directed studies and its counterparts at some other campuses, are so beneficial, because actually students there are often exposed to some of the big issues in some systematic way over time. That having been, and I'm in favor of, we should come to this, I suppose, in the second part of this discussion of trying to foster those kinds of courses on campus. However, I think it's at odds.
Well, why don't you save that?
Okay.
Because we're going to go toward the constructive part of our discussion. We're going to take a 5-minute break for coffee, and it's really 5, and come back.
Okay.
I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.